Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this evening. We're just letting everyone in. So there'll be a few people joining. So just give us a few moments while people join. We have got over 150 people signed up tonight. So it could be a full house. We can fit a maximum of 100 people online at one time. We've currently got 40 and they're rapidly climbing. So thank you so much for your joining this evening. It's so lovely to have you here. I'm going to get started off by explaining who I am, and then I'm going to introduce you to these two lovely people. So my name is Victoria Bagnall, and I am the co-founder and managing director of Connections in Mind. And we're an organisation that specialises in raising awareness about executive functions and how we can all develop stronger executive functions. Now, executive functions are the brain processes that we find in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. So this is a bit of our brain behind our foreheads, and they help us to regulate our emotions, to help us manage time, to organise our belongings, and really just to get on with life. So they're essential parts of our brain makeup, which help us to contribute towards society and life generally. And I'm going to hand over now to Phil to start us off and introduce yourselves.
Hello, everybody. My name's Phil Anderton. Together with Lisa, we are the founders of an organisation called ADHD 360. We could easily write that off, I think, as an expression of we're providers of ADHD healthcare. Probably a bit too easy to do that, in so much as that for the last 20 years, Lisa and I have worked together off and on, trying to improve people's lives for people who have ADHD. And that journey has brought us through to eventually having our own healthcare business. Lisa as a career nurse, and myself coming through the criminal justice route of being a senior police officer, then working in the NHS, working in the pharmaceutical industry, and then realising there's a better way of doing this. So bringing that to fruition with 360. And I've probably stolen most of Lisa's thunder there, so I'll hand over to her while she's got a blank piece of paper and a blank mind on how to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Lisa Mangle, and I'm the other half of ADHD 360. So my background is that I've come through the NHS and worked in ADHD for 20 years, as Phil's just said. And we've been working in our own business for the last 2 and a bit years now, 2.5 years, where we assess, diagnose and treat from the age of 4. I think my youngest patient is, and my eldest patient is 76. I'm very proud of that. We change lives actually on a daily basis just by understanding, diagnosing, treating and supporting people who've struggled for many years. And I love my job. It's not a job, it's a hobby really.
Introductions done. We're back to you now, Victoria.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for those introductions. So you're joining us this evening because a hot topic came up on our Facebook group before Christmas, and we started discussing rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is something that symptom that comes alongside ADHD and a lot of other neurodevelopmental disorders as well, but really is recognized as being a symptom of ADHD. And so I reached out to you guys and I was like, help, my ADHD experts, can you give us some insights on this, and would you like to do a webinar? So you've been busy kind of collating all your knowledge and some case studies for us this evening, I see. So I'm going to hand over to you guys to take us through what you've prepared. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion at the end, and we'll have some time for questions from the audience as well. So if you do have a question as they come up, please do put them in the Q&A box, and you'll find that at the bottom of your screen to the right hand side of where we're speaking. So you should see that. So if you have a question as it comes up, please just do write it in there, and then we'll get to your questions at the end of the presentation in a few moments. Great stuff. So I will start sharing my screen if I can. Why don't I hand over to you, Phil, to get started?
Okay. A really interesting challenge that you set before us, Victoria, with RSD. It's almost, it feels, when Lisa and I were briefing in when you originally asked us to do this, it feels like one of the new sexy things to be emerging out of neurodiversity and challenges of neurodiversity. And yet, when we look at it, we've been dealing with RSD throughout our years of dealing with ADHD. It's the label that's perhaps become a little bit more modern, if you will, than what it's describing. And it does represent future thinking, I think, of how we manage and how we label, if you will, the nuances of neurodiversity and being neurodiverse. We've said for a long time, and we've said on many of these webinars that we've done together, ADHD isn't about being hyperactive, inattentive, and impulsive. ADHD is about, as you talk about a lot, Victoria, with us, it's about the executive functioning, and then what are the deficits of that executive functioning that manifest in impairment in somebody's life. And I would hope that within my lifetime, the label ADHD disappears and we have a more meaningful label that actually starts to describe the challenges and the outcomes that people have with this prefrontal cortex limitation, if you will. And the biggest barrier, I think, to changing the label is that our really sexy logo, which is over here on the left-hand side, will have to be changed. And I'm not sure what we'll change it to. But less flippantly, I think discussing things like rejection and sensitivity and challenges is the way forward for ADHD, and starting to label things appropriately in terms of impairment is exciting. We battle long and hard on a very regular basis with trying to convince some elements of society that ADHD is not about naughty boys, and it doesn't have to have a naughty boy syndrome to be classified under the DSM, the manual that we use for assessment. And I think this is a really exciting opportunity to discuss one of those emerging, more appropriate label opportunities for the impairment of ADHD. And I think, for me, we could draw the line under the session there and just sort of say, look, the reality is that feeling rejected and sensitive to rejection and sensitive to criticism is an impairment of ADHD. Let's stop discussing it. Let's just move on, because that's a fact. That's there. That's a reality. And we won't, because you've asked us to give an hour. So we'll have a look at it in a little bit more depth. But that's our reality, I believe, is that it is there. So if I could have my Chris Whitty impression, thank you very much, and have my next slide, please. Both Chris Whitty and I have both got a face for radio. What I'm going to do is lead the webinar through a series of slides, if I may, and bring Lisa in at key moments to provide that kind of medical background and that medical what's going on at the coalface perspective, and what we see on a regular basis. And Lisa, before I trot on into these slides, one of the things we've been discussing is how people manage rejection, and perhaps it's worth just having a couple of minutes of what we see in the clinic in the broadest terms. And I can think of a lady in Lincoln that we've got as a patient, and I can think of a man in Norwich that we were dealing with, both of whom immediately when we started talking about this sprang to mind. Do you want to talk about them for a second, just to bring this to life? As it
Yeah, we have several patients who, are very sensitive, and so their reaction to many experiences is to lash out and leave extreme voicemails and text messages and emails. And obviously, Phil and I are made to not take those things personally, because we know that those reactions in adulthood come from many, many years ago. But, you know, it's very difficult for the patient to begin to understand where those emotions are coming from. But they can be extreme, really extreme. You know, we've had patients who we've had to get the police out to and ambulances for, and you know, it's quite upsetting when you have a patient who is so distressed by something that to me seems small, but to them is absolutely overwhelming and life-stopping almost. And it can be difficult to deal with those situations. But I think one thing that Phil's really good at, and he's good at, well, he's calm for a start. So I think that's a good place to start. And he's reassuring, and he begins to explore the reasons for people's extreme behaviours, and where that may have come from in the beginning. But it's been extreme at times, hasn't it, Phil?
Yeah, as a clinical team, we've had the 11 o'clock till midnight threatening calls because a patient hasn't been able to get their medication on time, and what have you. And I think those kind of experiences are what we'll explore as part of going through these 6 steps to understanding, as we've labelled them, bringing our clinical work, both in terms of what we see in our patients and what our patients give us sometimes, to bring that level of reality. And Victoria, I'm kind of looking to you to sort of just check that that's the right trajectory for you. And I'll keep bringing you back in to make sure you're still there. Just to make sure that's the right trajectory for you for the next 50 minutes or so. Is that okay? Yeah, give me a nod. Yeah, okay. So if we're on a 6-step journey, as it were, let's have a look at the relevant ADHD bits. And the first bit that came to my mind before we started diving into the science and things, it was actually that 19 years ago, I think it was, Steve Brown and I, as police officers working in America, in the UK, on ADHD and criminal justice, we ran a survey of 250 families, 250 in the UK, 250 in the US. And one of the questions we asked them, and I keep returning to this in many, many presentations because it resonated then and it still does now, is when did you notice a change in your child? And what were those changes? And it was quite amazing that with 2 completely different nations, what parents were writing about was the change in the self-esteem of their child who has ADHD from the age of 6. And that to me struck a massive chord. It hit me like a sledgehammer in the face, really. I wasn't expecting that, and I wasn't expecting it to be duplicated on either side of the pond with such clarity. And when we looked at it and probed into it, by the age of 6, kids at school are already not included with their peers if they're neurodiverse, segregated at school by their teachers, kept in rather than having a break because they're behind with their work, therefore not getting to exercise, play, have fun, enjoy the moment with the kids they're at school with, embarrassing their friends and therefore being embarrassed and not understanding why, by both their conduct and their behaviour, and how when then delving deeper into that, how that starts a negative trend in the internal emotions of that individual and the internal emotions of that child. And it transpires that these are classic ADHD outcomes, which are manifested and have their roots from the age of 6. And, you know, the Flat Earth Society would tell us that kids can't show symptoms of ADHD at the age of 6. Well, they damn well can. Mm-hmm. And what's more important is they've got the emotional suffering of being impaired starting to affect them at this tender age. And, you know, as Lisa will testify, those children who are under 6 that we've treated, where protocol would say you shouldn't treat, is mainly because of things like this. When we look back on it, it's not because of hyperactivity or inattention. It's actually because of dysregulation of emotions coming from these feelings that we're talking about. And we've turned many a 4 or 5 year old's life around, kept them in school where they were never going to be. They were being excluded from nursery. And it has its roots, and we should not be frightened to talk about it in the build of internal negative emotions in the child. And Lisa, if I bring you in for a second, just to talk about, and it is really off guard, it's off piste, it's not the thing that you'd find an NHS clinician talking about, but that's about treating a 4-year-old who's at this place where their self-esteem has bottomed already, and how we've turned that round. Perhaps it's worth just exploring a couple of those quickly.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the age 6 for treatment is a little bit of a contentious area, and just to talk a little bit about science, the reason that age 6 for treatment is mainly because the clinical trials were done on 6 to 17-year-olds, and the reason for that is that there were questionnaires for the children involved in the clinical trials. So before the age of 6, the children were deemed too young to understand the question. So hence the medicines are licensed at the age of 6. But that doesn't mean they're dangerous before the age of 6. And when you've got a child who's struggling to go to school and not learning, not because they're not intelligent, but because they can't focus and can't sit still, and they're having outbursts at home, sometimes masking at school, but having outbursts at home, that's a difficult place for a 4-year-old to be. And so I'm quite happy, providing I think the child warrants treatment and the symptoms are impairing enough, that they're getting in the way enough, that starting treatment with the right support and the right monitoring is perfectly acceptable. And in my understanding is that the building blocks of learning occur in infant school. So that is from the ages of 4 to 7. So if you've got a child who is struggling significantly at the age of 4, they're not going to learn anything. And if they're not diagnosed and treated until the 7, then the building blocks of learning have gone, and that opportunity to catch up takes a while. And I just want to mention, Phil, something from today's clinic actually, that is a slightly different topic but builds into this slide. I actually assessed a 6-year-old boy today, and when we talk about self-esteem plummeting from the age of 6, this boy was clearly bright, real bright button, lovely lad, he was just like Tigger. I mean, he was all over the place. But when he went on to tell me that he sat on the stupid table, my heart just broke, because this boy knew that he was placed on the same table as other children who really struggled with the learning. And it was so obvious that this boy was intelligent. The language that he used, the stuff that he spoke about, his hobbies, his interests, and yet he told me he was on the stupid table. And then he came out with a comment about, and it literally is that 3rd bullet point, he said that I embarrass my friends and that's why they don't want to play with me. And he talked about being lonely in the playground, and then he talked about getting angry at home, and he masks at school but gets angry and frustrated, and he loses it at home, and he loses it really quickly. So that's the building blocks of why a child's self-esteem starts to plummet, when their understanding at the age of 6 is so powerful, but yet their words that they use about themselves are so negative. So I thought I'd just bring that in from an experience just today in clinic.
I think that's incredibly relevant and pertinent. And there was a question just popped up there about how do we get this message across, that we shouldn't wait to commence assessment and treatment where children have got these issues in such tender years. I find that we have two communication issues there, and I'll jump back to the slide, and I will stay on piece to Victoria, I promise you, but I'll answer this question. One is that parents often see it but are reluctant to treat with medicine. That's one of the bigger barriers that we have, and that's a parent's right to choose that. But I would ask that all parents do that from an educated perspective, not from a Google and social media perspective, and consult with the experts. And the second barrier is that a lot of school teachers don't see ADHD and don't see the emotional dysregulation and these trends in self-esteem, because they're looking for the naughty boys. And I think one of the biggest struggles we have is overcoming prejudice in the education system on what ADHD is and what it looks like and how it manifests. So I think it's constantly about education to answer that question. It's about education. Here's my drink. Bless. Thank you very much. Marvellous timing. Everybody meet my wife, Samantha. And she'll kill me for that. And it is about education and training, but it also, we've got to actually use opportunities like this, 100 people, to spread that message, spread that word, and have some faith and trust in the professionals, because I think that's hugely important. Back to the script, Victoria. You can smile again. If we think, hang on, not too quickly, lass. Go back a bit. No one does this to Chris Whitty, do they? Crikey. If we think about that plummeting self-esteem, that withdrawal, that self-esteem plummet from the age of 6, and then couple that with the performance deficits that naturally come with ADHD, of impulsivity, which isn't just about throwing a pencil without thinking about it, is emotional impulsivity and not being able to regulate things because there's no pause button. It's not, and it shouldn't be a surprise that people with ADHD cannot handle rejection or criticism as well as neurotypical people. And I think this will be the next debate, whereas 15, 20 years ago, we were debating whether or not it's in girls and boys or whether it went to adulthood. I think we need to start the debate on impairment. And this should not be a surprise. Impairment is huge, and it's emotional for the individual as well as the outbursts. So if I could have my next slide now, and it's important that we don't just deal with children, we look at adults as well. Challenges with their executive functioning, the prefrontal cortex that Victoria talks about so well, and how that is the conductor of the orchestra being the rest of the brain. And if the instruments in the rest of the brain are played out of tune and out of time, we might have incredibly skilled musicians, but it sounds like a complete farce of music. And that's when the prefrontal cortex doesn't work properly. That's what's going on in the ADHD brain. And these are constant daily challenges. Russ Barkley, everybody knows I've got a man crush on Russ. He says it's not a deficit of knowledge, it's a definite deficit of performance. And we were with him 2 weeks ago, and he was reinforcing that point to us yet again. It's a deficit in performance. So we've got somebody who's had a very emotional upbringing through life, not parental necessarily, but their whole emotional forward-thinking way of life is being crushed around them. They are struggling to get their conductor to work properly with the orchestra of their brain. And by the time adult comes along, to the ill-informed, they're presenting as if they were depressed. And I don't know what the number is, but the extremely high percentage of our adults who we treat and change their lives, who've been in and out of the GP surgery for the last God knows how many years, presenting with depression but not responding well to the drugs for depression. It's a constant. It's a known, absolute known constant in clinic. And these poor people have a total fear of failure. And Victoria, remember that procrastination session that we did last year, where the fear of failure was one of the main reasons that people will not start to do things and move forward. And this group really have that fear of failure, and how that plays into EF, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's all this work on, your growth mindset and things like that. But what we find is that a lot of people with executive function challenges have a really fixed mindset and they're so scared of failure. They're like, I can't try, because if I try, I might fail, and that would be even worse. And so it can be very paralyzing, in fact, in terms of making progress and developing as individuals.
Paralyzing, what a great word to sum up where that, and then being like that on a daily basis. If I'm allowed to swear, and I think I've used this expression before, I don't think people in this presentation are depressed. I think they're situationally pissed off, because for where they've got to in life, they've got a fear of failure. Their self-esteem is low. They don't want to start new things. No, they're not included the same. Everything's harder, and everything becomes a challenge. And I don't want anybody telling me I'm stupid anymore. I don't want to be told I've not got this right anymore. It's a constant nagging sore that they cannot cure, that this is going on every day, and they are situationally pissed off. And the way to treat them is not to use depression drugs, it's to actually cure the cause, or fix the cures, and look at the possibility of this presenting being ADHD. And Lisa, you talk a lot about the fuse and that the high jump bar that people have, and perhaps it's worth just having a couple of minutes on that. You often talk about it in children, but it's relevant for everyone. Give us that anecdote of that.
So I talk to my children and adults about a lose it line. So I basically draw a line on a graph, and then I draw a line just below the lose it line, and I describe this is where you are all the time, and it only takes one little blip and you cross over that lose it line, and then you just explode. And it appears that you're going from 0 to 100 like that, but you're not actually starting at 0, you're starting at 99, and the minute you go over that lose it line, it's gone. And actually, I was thinking about another patient that I've seen today, who is a byproduct of this build-up of frustration from the age of 6, and he's now 22, and he is so short fused. He just loses it all the time. His relationships fail because of it. His relationship with his sibling is non-existent. His relationship with his parents is very tricky. He's a really bright kid, and I got so frustrated doing his assessment because he was an absolute classic ADHD in an era where ADHD has been around. I've been working in ADHD longer than he's been born, and he's still been missed. And he's been missed because he's clever and he's not failing to a school's perspective, but he's failing to his own level. And this poor kid is losing it constantly. And when I spoke to him and talked the right language, he was just elated that somebody had understood where he was at. But on the downside, he was using substances, and I mean hardcore substances. He scored 6 out of 10 on our substance misuse scale, which is unusual. And I wasn't expecting a kid at university. I was expecting someone in a darker place than he was. But he was losing it all the time. He was so close to that lose it line all the time, being in trouble with the police and everything. So, but treatment can help with that, and identifying his issues a long time ago would have made life so much easier for him. Sad but good that he got here.
Indeed. So if step 1 is the relevant ADHD understanding, and step 2 is accepting that it goes forward into adulthood from those foundation stones, and step 3 really is understanding, that was your cue there, Victoria. Step 3, come on, keep up, it is that fear of failure that we're discussing. A fear of failure that in your 22-year-old has been with him for 16 years, day in, day out, every hour, every day. And as responsibility in life grows, that frustration continues to grow. back to the depressed thing. Why do things if I'm going to fail? And we talked about it in the procrastination piece, but also talk about it in the emotional piece and how that pushes you closer and closer to the lose it line on a constant basis. The mountain of constant criticism for failure, for getting things wrong. And I don't believe it takes a rocket scientist to work out when you've had enough of this and you're so situationally pissed off that you just don't want it anymore. You can't take it anymore. And why would you have to? Praise and good results are often lacking. And they're also really difficult to start accepting because you don't believe it. You don't believe your own press. You don't believe what's saying to you. And a lot of these patients that we have, when you actually say, do you know what? You've done a really good thing today. What's that? You've put yourself up for treatment. You've put yourself up for assessment. And I've had patients cry at that point because they actually start to believe that they've done something right, even if it's only to admit to themselves that they're impaired and they may need help. It's a huge, huge moment. And they all without fail, they all get to the stage where they can't see the wood for the trees. They can't see beyond this failure problem, this criticism problem. And you know, people that we've worked with very, very closely who've either tried to take their own life or who've had suicidal thoughts because they just can't cope with it anymore. It's beyond belief. And as Lisa says, 20 odd years of dealing with ADHD in our work, and yet we're still seeing people presenting like this to us who've been missed through the school system, through the education system. And there was a comment.
Can I just comment that, you know, the suicidal ideation statement that you've just made, because when we assess patients, that's one of the things that we delve into with children and with adults as part of our risk assessment. And it makes me sad how many patients, when I say, have you ever felt suicidal? Have you had suicidal thoughts? About 75% of my patients say yes. And when you delve into the reasons why, this is a lot of the reasons why, you know, this failure, this, and even this 22-year-old today. And it's about asking the right questions and getting the right answers, because this kid's not being picked up because he's not failed as far as education's concerned. And when I delved into his history, his academic history, he did well in his GCSEs, and that's because he was clever and he could just walk it. He didn't need to revise. He didn't really need to pay attention in lesson. He just needed to turn up and do an exam. When it got to his A-levels, he got 3 Bs, which looks great. But you know what? He were capable of A stars. When he did his first degree, he got a 2-1, but he were capable of a first. And that's all he could tell me. Not that I'd passed all these exams, but what I hadn't done. And that constant failure in his eyes just really, really took its toll. And it's about really delving into someone's story and someone's history to make sure that you're getting the right information out. It's really important, not just, oh, well, he passed everything, so he must be okay. No, it's not that simple. It's really not that simple.
And what we find in a lot of patients, thanks Lisa, is that the coping mechanisms that have developed through childhood into adulthood become one of two things, and we could almost categorize in a binary way. It's either fight or flight. The flight is the procrastinator that doesn't want to do anything. The fighter has only got one coping mechanism to cope with anything that's not going their way, and that is to batter their way out verbally or physically or both. And I'll talk about one of those in a wee while. Can we just tramp onto the next slide, please? Thanks. These triggered emotions. Our session with Russ Barkley a couple of weeks ago, he talked long and hard about triggers. And there's a question popped up here. Is there a distinction between RSD and ODD? And the most certainly is. And the difference will come out as we go through the next couple of slides. Build into that. Trigger points are hugely important for feelings of rejection. And where we've got a struggle regulating emotion that is built around the trigger point, what I'm about to say now is just so straightforward and easy to think about. Remove the trigger point. And if we can start to learn what those trigger points are, we can start to actually remove that emotional dysregulation opportunity, remove the opportunity. And if someone's going to fight and have aggression and bring some really unpopular, deep-seated flurry of activity that's negative to the front, remove the trigger. Flight is harder to work with in a lot of ways. It's seemingly unseen. Still waters running deep. People who withdraw themselves, but those triggers are still there, and we have to look for and work with those trigger points. And Barclay, if we go to the next slide, he was very, very clear the other week with us, and I do hang on his work because he just brings everything together in such a good way. Could I just have the next slide, Victoria, please? And he talks that ADHD emotions, and therefore the RSD that's linked to ADHD emotions, are time limited. They're not moods. They're time limited around a trigger. They are very setting specific. They are quite rational when we actually understand what's gone before and think about the previous slides and think about those trigger points. Think about the stuff we talked about the lose it line. There's a rationale to this, and there's often a provocation. Whether that provocation is deliberately provocative or not, it doesn't matter. There's a rational argument to what's going on. We might not agree with the feelings of the person who is feeling rejected and their reaction to this, but there is a rationale. Whereas, to go back to the oppositional discussion of mood disorders, those emotions are long durations. They are proper moods. They are not trigger-based. They're not situational. They're cross-situational, not setting-specific, very excessive or extreme and capricious, and irrational and hard to put a rationale to. And that's the fundamental difference in what we're trying to learn and understand here, is that if we have a trigger point and if we have a situation that can be removed, then we can actually start to reduce, if not eliminate, the opportunities for rejection and emotional dysregulation that comes from rejection by dealing with things differently. And it's just quite classically a bit of analysis and a bit of skills in the person dealing with the person who's feeling these things. I go back to my policing days, where Steve Brown and I very quickly learned that when coaching and training police officers around the Northern Hemisphere, as we did, trying to get them, imagine yourself sitting with 40 odd American police officers, all who are huge, they're all armed, and you're running a training session for them where you think, if I don't get this right, I'm going to be in a right queer street here. I've got to get this, I've got to nail this session. And trying to convince them that if you're presented with somebody who is reacting in this fight way because of their emotions and what could be their ADHD, it's for us to change our behaviour, not expect that person to change theirs, and then making that the rationale for life. It's for us to change, not to expect them to change. And when Lisa very kindly said, I can be calm and a calming influence, I don't think I am particularly calm in anything. In fact, I can lose it. I've got a lose it line, the same as everyone else. But I think what I've learned over 20 years is I'm never going to get somebody who's poorly, whose poorliness is causing them to not be able to regulate their emotions. I'm not going to get them to change. I've got to actually be the person that changes my approach and try and change the setting, try and reduce the trigger. And that's the key to working this through. We had a patient today, one of my anecdotes from the clinical setting today, if I can, who were drunk because their GP wasn't issuing their medicine in a timely manner that this patient wanted them to. And this mum of a child literally chewed the left ear off one of my team in the office because the GP wasn't prescribing and starting prescribing under shared care in the time that she wanted this to happen. And poor Ashley, our supervisor in the back office, really got the brunt of this. So we managed it as a complaint. 10 minutes after she'd had this conversation, I rang the mum and just sort of said, okay, we've had this conversation. You've got your views. What is it that you're trying to get to? Where is it we need to help you get to? And it was very clear that the trigger had been the GP and the way the GP had dealt with her, not anything that we'd done. And she'd had a blast off, had a fight, and now by not being the GP, not trying to represent the GP, and just coming at it from a completely different angle and accepting the rationale of her feelings, that they were genuine, that she was disappointed, she'd been let down, and then trying to work away with her and find a better answer. That emotional outburst was calmed almost immediately. And that's not about my skill set. It's about the fact that if we can remove any connection to the trigger, we can change that scenario for that individual. Yeah. And it happens.
Can I just jump in there as well, actually, just to say that what we've found in our work is that empathy is the most powerful tool in this particular situation. And that is about like recognizing the emotion and feeling that emotion with the person and validating that that's okay to feel that emotion. And that can really help people move through these difficult emotions that they're feeling, and because they feel, okay, it's fine, I can feel that, they can move through it, and then we can get to having a rational conversation. But empathy is such a strong antidote to these emotional outbursts in terms of helping that person to regulate. Sorry, I'll let you carry on, Phil.
No, it really better, because what that counselling skill, Victoria, that coaching counselling skill is removing the trigger. That empathy is actually a subtle way of removing that trigger, and there we prove that it's an ADHD based thing, because it's not extensive of a long duration. It's not without rationale. There is a rationale, and mum, I would suggest that mum has undiagnosed, untreated ADHD. Mum has had that rejection from somebody, and her only coping mechanism that she has in her arsenal is to fight and shout and shout and fight and fight and shout. And it was quite a classic case to see, and very easy to actually then deal with if we, to use your word, Victoria, if we empathise, and if we don't expect them to change, but we change the scenario and remove the trigger. And if we go forward to the next slide, if this is making any sense, there's a pathway coming here in terms to where we go next. This model of what we can and can't control in terms of emotional impulsivity and dysregulation, it tells us that we'd have 3 or 4 hours on this model in itself. And I want to stay on the yellow end if we can, and focus on the yellow end, because core ADHD-based emotional impulsivity and dysregulation can be controlled with medication and treatment. So the yellow end is where we would look to treat medically. And as we progress further down, where we get to the need for cognitive change and modifying responses, that's where CBT and other coaching and other support kicks in the emotional journey. Now, if we can lessen the situational stuff, a combination of this is where medicine will work, but it's also where removing the trigger, changing the situation also happens. If we've got a child that is constantly being triggered by something going on in their classroom, whether it be another pupil or something going on with that teacher or that environment, we are not going to be able to change the child's reaction to this. We have to change the trigger. And that level of awareness of trigger change is where we start to get success. And it goes back to, as a cop, just remembering that it's for the cop to change, not for the person with ADHD. It's to understand the environment needs to change if that's the trigger. If we really, really, really aren't getting on with Billy, and that's the trigger to emotional dysregulation, why the hell do we make that child sit next to Billy every day? Why not flip and move them to somewhere else? The power dynamic of, well, we've been giving in, is utter nonsense. What we're doing is actually trying to turn something into success. and change that power dynamic successfully. So if we just jump to the next slide, Victoria, please. I'm mindful of the clock tramping on. We have to remove the situation, the trigger, or change the dynamic to reduce the amount of prevarication, where you sit, who you sit next to, who you talk to, what alternative tasks to bring with you, something for self-calming, take your mind off things. And then as you get further down the journey, start to teach the coping mechanisms of being able to project your mind into a different space, think positive thoughts, think differently, and so on. And if there's any message that is about rejection and sensitivity for people with ADHD, it's got to be, don't expect them to grow out of it. Find the triggers, remove the triggers, treat the ADHD, and we will start to have success with RSD. If we try and treat it any other way, we'll get absolutely nowhere. The next slide takes us to, what we can do to help. We should massively accept the crossover of ADHD and RSD. And that goes back to that very first slide about impairment. It's not about being impulsive. It's not about inattention and those three bloody words that everyone talks about for being ADHD. It's about impairment. It's about looking at what is impairing as a consequence of the conductor not performing well for the orchestra, and make sure there is an accurate diagnosis. And Lisa's role is unashamedly, as a clinician, specialising this, and I would say probably more than any other clinician in the nation, because in most clinics you get a specialist in 5 or 6 different elements of neuroscience, which I find difficult to qualify as being a specialist, because we've gone into a broad brushstroke of illness. CAMS, by definition, is across a multitude of disciplines. Lisa's got this beautiful opportunity to be an expert in one thing, and that is ADHD assessment, diagnosis, and treatment. And that unlocks a whole new sense of opportunity for the patient, as long as they're in the right clinic, that they get actually seen by the right person to do the right thing. And there's no doubt about it that we have a very particular view at 360, that we are specialists in one thing and one thing only, and we're not going to take on the world. Now, things like RSD are massively in our gambit, because it's an impairment of ADHD, which we are specialists in. And we should be appreciating the level of impairment beyond what the DSM gives us as its criteria. And we should look at treatment options, which drugs can have a calming effect. And Lisa, I'll bring you in a minute to talk about medication. And, we've spent a lot of time with scientists looking at different medications for ADHD that can actually have a negative effect on people with an RSD kind of impairment and output. Choosing the right medication, and then later on in the journey, choosing the right coaching, executive functioning work, and building up strength and resilience through coping mechanisms. And going back to that 6-year-old and the question, we should intervene as soon as possible. Can I bring in at that point, Lisa, to talk about the kind of the medical approach that we consider here?
Yeah. So for someone who has, these kind of difficulties, having the right treatment is key. So I think for me, I would choose a medication that is more calming on the body, less stimulating in terms of less raising of pulse and blood pressure. So this is the reason why Incuniv is a really good medication. So originally Incuniv was used for hypertension, so high blood pressure. So its side effect profile is actually that it lowers your blood pressure and lowers your pulse. So it's got a very calming side effect profile. It also helps with sleep. So again, that helps with mood and emotion. And it also covers 24 hours a day. So, when you've got an issue like this that is impactful across the day, not just for for the daytime when stimulants are going to work. Inciniv is a 24-hour-a-day product. So you have to look at the kind of medication that you're going to use and the side effect profile and what it does physiologically to the body. Then lowering the blood pressure and pulse, which then lowers the fight-flight process, is a good product to use. So that's the kind of medication that I would be looking towards. And it is licensed in children, but it doesn't mean that I can't use it in adults. So I do have quite a few adults on Inciniv with really good response rates. So it's about getting the right medication for the right patient with the right symptoms. And that's what we do really well, I think, at 360. There's no one size fits all. It's about getting it right for each patient.
There's an interesting question here, Lisa, about if we specialise in ADHD, what do we do with the likes of anxiety and OCD? And the answer to the question, which you've partly led into there, is that as and when, and they most likely are, anxiety and compulsion behaviour being a byproduct of all these things we're talking about, of the impairment of ADHD, it becomes something that we treat not by working with the anxiety per se, but by working with the cause of the anxiety or the cause of the compulsion. And we've got some amazing case studies, which one day, Lisa, we need to put our foot on the ball and write up, in terms of the physical health manifestations of anxiety. For instance, high blood pressure, hypertension, and how specialists would not treat ADHD because of high blood pressure, and weren't seeing that the anxiety that was caused by this stuff that we're talking about tonight was causing the high blood pressure. And if you actually take away the cause, then how can I concentrate when you can't falling all over your shoulders?
Sorry.
What was I supposed to do? If you can reduce the cause of the anxiety, then the anxiety will diminish, but you're also doing better with the ADHD and keeping it away. And
I just add to that, because you mentioned it earlier, Phil, about depression and anxiety. So 75% of my adult patients come to my clinic with a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, or both. And of those 75%, once I've treated their ADHD properly, 90% of those symptoms resolve. So it is about finding out what else the patient has. Is it a true depression, anxiety that needs treatment in its own right, or actually is treating their ADHD going to really impact positively on the depression and anxiety? And the other thing to say is something that you talk about quite a bit, is that if they've got coexisting autism, are certain medications helpful, or do they often bring out things like aggression? So again, medications like Inciniv are brilliant for patients who have ADHD and autism, because you're providing a medication that allows the children to be the same 24 hours a day, so there's no ups and downs of how they feel, and that sits well with someone who has a coexisting autism. So we don't just look at ADHD, although we are ADHD specialists. We are always looking at those coexisting conditions and thinking, right, what are the best medications in these instances, and fighting as clinicians to get it right for the patient. And we don't stop until we've got the treatment as optimal as possible. But that's a really good question. There was another question I saw as well about might be on the
one about beta blockers here. Is that the one?
No, there was one about if you don't get it right, then do you do medication? And so my answer to that was, why wait until a child's failed before you even consider medication? I don't see medication as a last resort. I see it as, you know, parents have often tried everything before they come to us. So the behavioural strategies have often already been done. I don't want a child to fail and be sad and miserable and school refusing and, you know, no friendships and being close to that lose it line before we even consider medication. I see medication as being part of helping a child with their basic ADHD symptoms. And there was also another question right at the beginning that I am going to address because it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, around medication turning children into zombies. So it's a very Daily Mail headline, but my perception on this statement is that, I'll give you an example. I had a parent phone me up telling me that they thought their child had been turned into a zombie by my treatment. And I said, go on then, just explain to me what you're talking about. And she said, well, on Saturday morning, they just sat and read a book for 2 hours. Okay, well, this child was so hyperactive when I assessed him. Oh my gosh, he was literally just bouncing off the walls. So when I'd removed that hyperactivity and impulsivity, what was left was a child who wanted to read, who had never read a book for 2 hours in his life and was just loving and devouring a book. And so, yes, that child was very different. You know, he wasn't that bouncy child that the mum had been used to and loved, but he was quite happy reading a book. And so I actually think, this is my thoughts, and shout me down if you want to, but I think those kids who are perceived as being turned into zombies are actually an introvert in an ADHD body. And so when you then strip away that impulsive, hyperactive, inattentive child symptoms, you are left with their default, which is actually a child who likes to recharge their batteries on their own, in their own room. So it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time as to why this perception about this turning children into zombies. And it's something that I am going to monitor every day until I get to the bottom of it. But medication shouldn't turn a child into a zombie. And if it does, they're on the wrong medication, and that needs looking at. But I just thought it's a bit of a bugbear of mine because it's a misconception, I think.
We had a mum once rang us up, Lisa, do you remember, back in the early days, and said, you've destroyed my child, they're no longer what they were. And okay, wow, what is it that's changed, that's caused this? And mum said, he's 6 and he's now holding my hand as we walk down the road.
Yeah.
And next to the traffic, you're frightening him to death. He's got no confidence anymore. Well, what was he doing before? Well, he was running across the road, darting between the buses, jumping up and down walls. And said, hang on, I think what's happened is your child's become a normal 6-year-old. Let's turn this back to emotional dysregulation and rejection if we can. Can we? Can I
just say we are at time now. I think we're going to run over, which is fine. But if anyone does need to leave, you can just leave if you need to go. But we'll be staying on, I think, for at least another few minutes to finish off the webinar.
Won't be long, Victoria. Sorry.
No worries.
If we could tramp on 2 slides, that's the one. So if we look at rounding this up, if you will, about rejection and sensitivity. It is a way that people express some of the common characteristics of ADHD, and we should see that and acknowledge that this is an impairment that is bloody obvious when you look at the history, the foundations of what's gone on from the age of 6 at least. It can and probably does stem from childhood. It's not something that just happens in adulthood. And it can be treated and managed treatment and therapy. There's no doubt about that. We can all help by changing the trigger point and helping someone move further away from the lose it line and looking for those triggers and constantly trying to change them. And if we can't acknowledge that, at least change our own behavior with somebody who's at that flashpoint. And we should really aim to protect the feelings of those around us who have ADHD, and children, young adults, and adults indeed, and empathise, to use Victoria's perspective, and your great words there about empathy. And there's a thing the NHS force upon us, which actually has some merit, which is quite unusual for some of the things they force upon us. And it's the duty of candour when dealing with people who've got a complaint. And what they ask you to do with the duty of candour, which is legislatively controlled now, is to actually acknowledge that person has some feelings which are making them complain. Whether we agree with the complaint or not, the feelings for that individual are there and they're real and tangible. And the first thing to do is actually acknowledge that they're there and be sorry that those feelings are there. Now, how can I help you work through that? And it struck me when we were doing some duty of candour training a couple of weeks ago with the team, that actually that's one of the mechanisms to deal with emotional dysregulation and people who are feeling rejected. And I think we can all learn from that constant ability to empathise and say to ourselves, I have no idea what this complaint or these feelings are about, but I can see that they're real for the person I'm dealing with. And how that changes your own lens on your approach is huge. And I was going to finish with a case study. I brought it in earlier because it fitted in, but I had to explain to 3 GPs who rang me last week. They were ringing to complain that our treatment wasn't suitable for an ADHD adult that was one of their patients, because that patient had lost their rag and shouted at them when they refused shared care. And I had to take 3 GPs right through the whole RSD scenario, the fear of rejection, a lifetime of rejection. And you've sat there and calmly said, you're not going to prescribe on the NHS because you think that the patient going privately should be able to pay for their medicine privately forever. And you expect someone who's been put down since the age of 6 to tolerate that and cope with it. You've got to change your approach and change that trigger. Because if you don't change the trigger, something's going to go wrong constantly between you and this patient. And the problem isn't the patient. The problem is that you have just been the trigger for an emotional dysregulative outburst, and that sits with you. And having to coach 3 GPs on this was outstanding when they'd rung to tell us that we weren't treating the patient properly, and they were doing this kind of nonsense with a human being. And as I say on the last line, and as a consequence, I convinced them to share care and write prescriptions for that patient as well, which I took as a particular success. Victoria, I'm going to hand back to you. That was my last slide. I think that hopefully just rounds it all off, that it stems from childhood, looking for the triggers. This is real. This is about emotion. It's about the front part of the brain not working as the conductor, and we should be able to work with this better than we do.
Absolutely, Phil. And as always, we sing from the same song sheet with all of this work. And it's just so much. We see so much of this work in the work that we do. This RSD, and it comes out in so many different ways. But the best thing that we can do as professionals and people who care about the subject, who are online today, here because they want to learn about it, is to spread the word. That this is a thing, and to get people to understand that executive functions and challenges we have with our executive functions are totally human and natural, and so everyone has them to a different extent, and there's not a single person that we've ever met, even the 500 plus teachers we've trained, who have a perfect executive function profile. So we all struggle with these things to some extent. But I think from my perspective today, hearing what you've said has really kind of cemented, my personal experience growing up as well, and that feeling of fear, of failure and fear of feedback as well. As a professional, having to try and be perfect all the time is really difficult. So when we were recording that video the other day, Phil, and I had that butterfly flying around, I was like, it's cool, that's fine, because perfection is not achievable. And if we go through life showing these polished versions of ourselves, it doesn't help people who really struggle with these things to understand that it's actually quite normal and quite human to find these things difficult, and perfection isn't achievable, and it's not human to be perfect all the time. So thank you so much.
I'm just mindful, Victoria, that there's a lady, Stephanie Fade, who's asked a question, and I can't find the question, and I don't want to actually noticeably.
Okay.
Re-asked,
Let's have a look at the other questions. There's a couple of questions that I saw coming in about, is this recorded? Yes, it is recorded. You'll be getting an email tomorrow with kind of highlights and also the recording in there. And please feel free to share that with anyone who you think might find it interesting. Yes. Stephanie. So Stephanie, was your question, do you have, it's in the answered bit of the Q&A, do you have experience of working with children who have traumatic early years experiences? That one, yeah.
I replied and just said yes, and the treatment would be patient specific. So I have got some patients who have experienced trauma. I've got some patients who are late to be adopted, and actually I've got one patient who's a sibling of 3 children, and I've started her medication, and it's been life-changing for her. She's on medication for ADHD and anxiety, and she's doing incredibly well. So yes, we do treat patients who've had traumatic, and actually it's one of my frustrations when I used to work in paediatrics, that if a patient was under CAMHS and there was any trauma, they wouldn't really consider the ADHD, but sometimes, especially in adopted children, they can have experienced trauma because the parent had ADHD that was untreated, and the genetic component of ADHD was passed on. You can't just say they don't have ADHD because they've experienced trauma. You have to take it holistically and look at the whole patient. And sometimes treating the ADHD allows you to then treat the trauma.
We find it's also kind of a chicken and egg scenario as well. I remember going to a British Psychological Society presentation on trauma, thinking, I'm going to find out, how we can work with children who have had traumatic upbringings. But actually, if you've been living with ADHD all your life, you've been experiencing chronic trauma since the day you were born. So it is a bit one of those as well. I know, as someone growing up with neurodiverse condition, probably ADD as well, that it's been traumatic, and I'm suffering from that still as an adult. Great. All right. Well, we've run over time, but that's because we're so passionate about everything we have to say here. If anyone does have any specific questions that weren't answered today, please do feel free to email us at info@connectionsofmind.co.uk with your questions, and we will pass them on to Phil and Lisa if we can't answer them ourselves. The recording will be coming out to you tomorrow morning, so that you'll get that, and please do share it with everyone who would find it interesting. And if you need support from ourselves, please just do get in contact with us. You can Google ADHD 360, they come up at the top if you Google that, and Connections in Mind, similarly, if you Google Connections in Mind, we come up top then. So just Google us and reach out to us, and we're here to support. That's what we do.